Steamboat Institute has experienced firsthand the joys of censorship, as some of our program videos have been removed from our YouTube channel. The reason cited by YouTube, which is owned by Google, is always the vague violation of community guidelines. Apparently, YouTube does not like discussions which include such nefarious topics as civic responsibility and election integrity. Our next panel will tackle this pervasive problem with censorship, partisanship, and whether it is even possible to move beyond bias and partisanship in either traditional media outlets or on social media. And now, to introduce our panel, I would like to welcome back to the stage Jillian Melcher, editorial page writer for the Wall Street Journal, and 2015 Tony Blankley Fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Jillian graciously agreed to step in for Tom Rogan, who had to cancel his trip to stay in Washington, D.C., and do his job covering the debacle in Kabul. Welcome, Jillian.
All right, well, we are in for a great panel today. Our guests, I'm going to have you guys come out. Christina Arriaga, she belongs to the Facebook Oversight Board, but has also been an outspoken voice for free speech and religious liberty. And that includes serving as vice chair on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and as a U.S. delegate to the UN Human Rights Commission. So she's very familiar with being a conservative in liberal territory. We also have Hugo Gordon. He's the editor-in-chief of the Washington Examiner, former editor-in-chief of The Hill. He worked as an op-ed writer for the Daily Telegraph in Hong Kong, Tokyo, and London and elsewhere. So we're very excited to have them here. And I'm going to kick this off by actually asking each of them to share a couple brief comments about what's on their mind on this wide-reaching topic. I'm also going to go to you guys, because I know there's a lot of concern about media bias, media integrity right now. So check out that QR code on your table, send me questions. I'll get them on the iPad and I'll ask as many as I can. All right, with that, I'm gonna kick it off to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for not booing me, as I've been booed in other places, and I enjoy that. It's invigorating. I like to engage in the art of persuasion with audiences that may or may not agree with me, so thank you. So I have no doubt that social media platforms discriminate and censor conservatives. No doubt. Let's start there. John, you mentioned it this morning. I'm sure some of you may have been to Facebook prison. It's a problem. But the question is, how do we resolve this? And there are three options. First one is government regulation. And this brings Mark Zuckerberg, Senator Josh Hawley, and Nancy Pelosi to the same table, which is no small feat. All of them have called for the government to eliminate something called 230. And without getting into too much detail, and we can speak about it later, what this law says is that when, for instance, my new friend, the Boxes, decide to post something on Facebook that's nasty or discriminatory, I can sue the Boxes, but I cannot sue the social media platform, in other words, Facebook. And they want to eliminate this. They want people to be able to sue the social media platforms. Well, what's the other side of that? They think that eliminating 230 only eliminates protections for big platforms like Facebook. But no, it eliminates protections for your local house of worship. It eliminates protection for your local supermarket. And if you think that's too far-fetched, only a few years ago, a website called roommates.com, trying to match roommates together, put a questionnaire out. Do you want a roommate who's married? Do you want a roommate who's a woman or a man? Do you want a roommate who has children? And the Fair Housing Administration office in, of course, California, sued roommates.com, and the court agreed, the Ninth Circuit agreed, saying, yes, they were demanding to find identifying information. Come on, they were asking about people living together. Eventually, that was overturned, but eliminating 230 would create an enormous problem for all websites, Facebook could absorb the cost of that, but it would eliminate free speech in social media platforms, particularly for us conservatives. The second one is to have the government regulate social media platforms, create the equivalent of the FTC. Do you want the DMV regulating what you're saying online? I don't think so. So I'll move on to option number 2. Facebook has 4.9 billion users. This is half of the world. So some people have said, well, let's have international law regulate Facebook. Do I need to explain how influential China is at the UN system? Again, eliminate that. Well, there's a third option for us conservatives, and that is a self-regulatory entity. And one of the reasons that is important is because we as conservatives agree that companies should be able to run their businesses according to their own belief systems. Only a few years ago, there was a case, Hobby Lobby, that appeared before the Supreme Court. The owners of Hobby Lobby, the lovely Barbara Green and David Green, were running their business according to biblical principles. They did not want to participate in the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, because Obamacare forced them to distribute 20 FDA-approved contraceptives. 16 of them were garden variety contraceptives. They didn't have a problem with that, but 4 of them, the government itself admitted, produced or culminated in abortions. And the Green family, and at the time they had 46,000 employees and were in almost every single state, they were willing to give up their business if they had to distribute these abortion-causing drugs. The government, what did the government respond? No problem, we'll just fine you $100,000 a day. So they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that when you start a corporation, when you start your own business, you don't leave your civil rights at the door. You get to live the First Amendment. That's why the New York Times has First Amendment rights. That's why corporations, churches that are incorporated, have the ability to preach whatever they want. So we do not, and Facebook is a private company. Do I agree with the values of Facebook? Not necessarily, but they should be able to run their business. So Mark Zuckerberg, when he started Facebook from his dorm room, never imagined that he would have 4.9 billion users, and he never imagined that he would be embroiled in some of the biggest freedom of expression issues of the world. So he created this oversight board, this independent entity, and he did 3 things. He funded it, he populated it, and he pledged to obey it. The oversight board has 3 interlocking mechanisms, and there's trustees, a board of 20 freedom of expression experts, and a body of staff. I am one, sorry, Cubans over-gesticulate, so I will be hitting the microphone. I'll try not to. So I, a conservative, I'm one of the 7 trustees, and we can talk more about it later, but in essence, what social media platforms can do is they can create a new culture of freedom of expression around the world, and that is not something that laws and regulations can create. And I'll just give you the example I give younger students. When I came to the United States, I witnessed a great miracle. I grew up in Puerto Rico. People stop at a stop sign, whether there's a police officer or not. People stop at a traffic light. In Puerto Rico, the traffic light is the colors of the flag of Italy, or a strong suggestion to look both ways before you run the red light. How do you change that? You cannot do it with a police officer at every corner. You need to change the culture, and social media platforms have the ability to do that. Thank you.
Okay, well, the first thing I want to do is, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank Jennifer Schubert-Aitken for handing me this poison chalice. The other panels have been asked to describe some things which were current and some things which were historical. We up here are supposed to decide on the future of the media, so we're looking into the future, which is, I don't know whether we have the gift of prophecy, but we're going to try and get to that. So the first thing I want to do is just talk about the idea of bias. Can we move beyond bias? The question I ask is bias really the problem? Do we want to move beyond bias? I would certainly start off by saying that we have an extremely tendentious and deceptive media which has disgraced itself year after year for a considerable period of time in various different ways, both by what they have written, what they have omitted, by the elisions that they have made, and by the sort of drawing of conclusions and the pollution itself of news with opinion. But I don't think the bias per se is the problem. We all have bias. There's a large word here, freedom. I think everybody in this room has a strong bias toward freedom and against central control. So we're never going to eliminate it. And I know from personal experience, especially at my work at the Daily Telegraph, I want to give you an example, that having strong opinions, which one might regard as one's bias, does not prevent one from doing this job properly. At the Daily Telegraph, we were sometimes referred to as an arm of the Conservative Party in Britain. We had extremely strong, pungent commentary pages in which we criticized the socialist, that is to say the Labour MPs, very sharply. But we were also well known for being the paper that the Labour MPs in Parliament wanted to read. It was not because they liked what we wrote about them, but because we presented news in a highly compelling and accessible way. And so it was not remotely uncommon to be in one of the smoking rooms of the House of Commons, you know, and presumably they're not called smoking rooms anymore, and to see Labour MPs actually looking at this newspaper. I think that's because Britain has a different culture, and this gives me a different perspective on the problem that has really taken place or come to pass in American media. There are three things that a news organization, a newspaper, should be doing. Absolutely the most important one is providing information. Secondary to that, they also have a duty, it seems to me, and an interest in entertaining, by which I mean being compelling, being interesting, really engaging the reader. And they have an interest in educating, which is to say persuading the reader. Most of that persuasion should be done on the commentary pages. In Britain, newspapers have always erred, if anything, on the side of entertainment, which has made some of them quite unreliable. But the United States has a very much more earnest culture than the British culture. And newspapers here have generally erred on the side of education, which is to say persuading people of what they think or how to think about certain subjects. And in the last several years, this has polluted the coverage of news and has displaced the supply of information. If your primary purpose, or if educating, changing people's opinions is overemphasized, it means you have an agenda, and an agenda is inclined to make you a participant rather than an observer. Journalists should always be outsiders. We should not become, in Britain, as they do some of them, knights or lords. They should not be the establishment. They should be outside observers telling people what is happening. And so what I oppose when I think about bias is what has happened in the United States, particularly in the last several years, where news pages have essentially been used to project opinion. I've been amazed, for example, reading the Washington Post, where reporters who I used greatly to admire, who were good reporters digging up news stories, have essentially written commentary pieces in which they use adjectives which, for example, the New York Times, Abe Rosenthal would have absolutely incinerated a reporter for using. He told a reporter that he should never use the word should. He said should is a word only to be used on the commentary pages. So it's not bias itself that is the problem. We all have our biases. But news should be primarily about the supply of information. And I mentioned the New York Times. It compromised itself. A couple of when its effort to prove collusion between the Trump administration and Russia, when that collapsed, it was essentially acknowledged that it had put all its efforts into trying to shoehorn the facts into that narrative, and it was going to switch, and now it's going to try and shoehorn all the facts in its reporting into the concept of institutional racism. So the point I would make is bias itself is not the problem. It's the wrong emphasis in what news really is about. It should not be about primarily persuading people through news. It should not be presenting news news should not be couched in a way to change people's minds. It should be telling them what they are. And you know this when there's some disaster. You know, if in the old days when you couldn't, the reporter would run in, he'd put his head around the door of the editor's office, he wouldn't comment about saying something awful has happened. He'd say, you know, the president has been shot, or the ship has sunk, or whatever it is. It's the information that is key. And so that's the way that I approach this problem.
Great. Well, I'm going to begin by asking a question that readers, family members, and the community often ask me these days, and I'm surprised because it's a question I've gotten a lot in recent years, but not throughout my entire journalism career. So I think it says something about this specific moment. And that question is, as a consumer of news media, how do I assess what's true or not? We've had foreign actors trying to insert disinformation to undermine public confidence. We've also had journalists behaving with an agenda, a political agenda, in an incredibly irresponsible way. So I would like both of you to answer, just from an expert perspective, how do you assess what is true and what is credible?
Well, it is indeed a very difficult problem. There are people, and I don't mean the marvelous wits at the Babylon Bee who are going to be following us up on the next panel, falsifying news and making up stories. There are people out there who want to pass off a pack of lies as facts. So it is a difficult thing to do. The first thing I would say is do not rely on fact-check organizations to tell you what is true. They are a blight on journalism. They are choking good journalism like a parasitic vine, and generally they have their own agendas. You know, if you scratch a fact checker, it might be someone who reached their ceiling in journalism, so left real journalism to go into this kind of quasi-journalism. Just as likely, it'll be someone who's never been a journalist before. And we've been in this extraordinary, I have employed people in my newsroom, taken them on as entry-level reporters, but they have had one previous job, and that was as a fact-checker at one of these So we have the astonishing thing where these people who come out of college and they're 22, and they're fact-checking people who've been in journalism or been experts in, we had I think it was actually a fact checker employed by Facebook, put a false flag on a story that was written by a fellow who's spent the last 20 years studying the subject. When we challenged them, they basically admitted they were out of their depth and took the flag down. But by then, the damage has been done. The story has been suppressed. Readers have not come to the story. You go through this lengthy process to get the flag removed. The other thing that has happened is they say, well, you know, you didn't include this piece of context. And really what that amounts to is saying, you didn't write the story the way I would have written it, which is actually what you find when a lot of reader complaints. They call and they say, I want to tell you about how you got something wrong. And you say, okay, well, let's have a look. And you have a look, and they say, well, but you didn't say this, and you did. All it means is they would have written the story in a different way. It's not our responsibility to write the story the way that somebody else wishes. We write it the way we think it will appeal to our readers. It's not our responsibility to write a story the way that some, 23-year-old thinks that we should, and who has been invested with all sorts of undeserved authority, which they didn't earn. So, first of all, don't go to fact checkers. I think the way to determine whether or not you're looking at, you can't tell immediately, but if you're reading a news organization, the information, a report by a news organization, which is out and out determined to shoehorn facts into a predetermined narrative, you should regard it with great skepticism. At the Examiner, and of course, I think, I can't remember it was Bob Woodson who said, example is much more persuasive than precept. We try to be an example. We absolutely divide news reporting from commentary. You're much more credible as a conservative news organization, as we are, if occasionally the stories you're writing make a conservative look bad because they've done something bad. If it's rather like, returning your taxes. If all the mistakes are in your favor, they know you're not really going to be plausible to the IRS.
Yeah, I agree. Don't trust the fact checkers. And let me give another perspective. Facts never persuade. Our mind did not evolve to be a logic processor. Our mind evolved to be a story processor. And that's the conclusion of the leading social psychologists that have studied this for a long time. If you haven't read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, What Good People Disagree About Religion and Politics, please do. It's a terrific book, and it will change the way you view the world. And let me illustrate what he does by giving you an example of one of the experiments that he conducted all over the world. So Fifi is your family pet, and this will require audience participation, so be prepared. Fifi is a family pet. Fifi is crossing the street. Fifi gets run over by a car. The family brings in Fifi. They cut up Fifi. They eat Fifi. Is this right or wrong? Raise your hand if you think it's wrong. Okay. Raise your hand if you think it's right. I have a shy group here. No one said, this is like, my parents were always late to church, so we always had to sit in the first pew. This is a little bit like this. Don't worry, you're not going to be graded. So did you notice that you made up your mind first, and then your mind started to chase down the reasons why you were saying right or wrong? This is called moral dumbfounding. The mind is like an elephant with a rider. The elephant is emotion and intuition, and the rider is logic. We evolved to get things done. We have the unique ability to decide what is right or wrong or true or false, depending on how many disciples we're going to get based on that. People watch political debates not to make up their mind who they're voting for, but to get even more arguments to support their own worldview. This is how we emerge. So how do we know what's true or what's false? Develop the habit of self-checking that conclusion. Develop a way to figure out why you think this is right or wrong. Reason evolved much, much later than the brain evolved, and the reason we have language, the language evolved much later than the brain. The reason we have language is to reason and to make up the reasons why we're determining something that's right or wrong. What's worse, the better we feel about our decision, the more we convince ourselves that we're right. So this is a great test to figure out why we're arriving to a conclusion, and it will also open doors on how you persuade others, because then you're standing on the other side. And this is something that unfortunately we're losing with cancel culture. For the first 200,000 years of human history, when we disagreed about things, we killed each other. You're a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, done. Yeah? You believe in the monarch, I believe in another system, oh, sorry, I have to kill you. And then we developed the ability to kill each other's hypotheses and theses and test it out. And that is where we find truth. And that is a much greater pursuit than just figuring out what's right or wrong about an article or a piece that we read. So I invite you to test yourself in that way.
So a related question to that, I do think one of the new things in media is that we now know in real time what our audience responds to. This is partly a function of social media. You can A/B test a headline and figure out what gets more engagement. You know which stories get traffic, often because they provoke a sense of outrage or moral indignation. And so I want both of you to answer this. This is actually a question from our audience. To what extent do you think that consumer bias fuels the perception or reality of media bias? And on top of that, since we have all this great data, and it's important marketing data and important for the success of the news business, what do we do about it? How do we make sure that it doesn't compromise the quality of journalism?
Go ahead.
Well, as the non-journalist, I can tell you that, of course, I mean, the reason that Facebook has 4.9 billion users is that they have developed the algorithms to figure out how to keep people online. So they're bombarding us with what we want to hear. So you Google search something, and it could be, in the time I was working on the Hobby Lobby case, I'm not an artsy person. I got so many arts and crafts ads in my Facebook feed. It's like, would you like to bead something? Yes, I would, but I'm not good at it. So of course, we're going to get bombarded, and it is also the satisfaction of getting that thumbs up, getting that little heart from your neighbor. All these things are very satisfying. And of course, there is a sense, I mean, journalism is an industry that it's a commercial industry in large part. So you want to write stories that people want to read. But I have great faith in the American people. The things that unite us, that interest, are the same. We all want fairness. We all want good people to get good outcomes. We all want cheaters to be punished. The fact that we have this knowledge of what is attractive to us as Americans and what's attractive to our human nature elevates us. And that is a principle, the principle of elevation is as powerful as any other principle. And what this elevation principle is in moral psychology is when we see someone doing something good, we actually have a physical reaction to it. When we hear of Mother Teresa, when we see someone outside helping a homeless person, when we see the images we saw last night, we're moved to tears. We have this terrific ability to elevate the behavior of all around us, and that's a good thing to know.
Can I just ask you to repeat the question?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I wonder if we're able to tell in real time what our audience likes, what they respond to. What's the way for media to maybe self-regulate while not disregarding marketing data, but also not playing into the worst impulses of our culture?
Well, yeah, there is very much attention, particularly in the media environment that we have, where a lot of news organizations are struggling to, to stay in the black. When I started in this business, newspapers used to have 25 to 30% margins. They certainly don't. They might have that, but in the negative sense now. So there's a very strong incentive to encourage people to click on this, and this has produced that that thing which we're all kind of rather bored about a decade ago, which was clickbait. My definition of that, by the way, is something which encourages you to click but then disappoints you, which always struck me as a rather bad business model. Something that gets you to click and then you read the story and you think, oh, that's interesting, is just a good headline. So I would always encourage people to distinguish between those two things. But the debate, but not just going with the flow, not just doing what your audience applauds and avoiding the things that get them riled up and angry at you, is a very important part of what we have to do, and the media has to do in the future. It will take courage. I have sometimes said, it sounds a little highfalutin, but I've had meetings with my editors and reporters, and I said, look, we're in the truth business. Clearly, we are trying to convey the truth. And this is a real problem when it comes to things like the extreme and radical transgender movement. Because are we to write stories that convey by their use of pronouns and things like that? Are they to accept the radical idea that a man can get pregnant and that a woman can impregnate him? Which is part of radical transgender theory. At the same time, we're not, whilst telling the truth as we see it, we don't want to be insulting or offensive. We don't want, as often as possible in a story, to keep on using if someone self-identifies, for example, as a woman, we don't want to kind of we don't want to be offensive in the way that we report it. There is a struggle between the truth and what your audience might demand of you. And I think that, we're in the truth business. We have to stick to it, and it takes a considerable amount of intestinal fortitude to do that rather than simply going with the flow. I don't think I have any better answer than that.
All right. Hugo, I want to ask you a question about anonymous sources. That's something that we've seen more and more of the media relying on. When is it appropriate? When should it be a red flag for readers?
It should always be a red flag when an anonymous source is simply insulting somebody else. We would not accept someone being anonymous if they were just going to say what a ghastly person someone was, or but it is important for news organizations to protect their sources. If the source is, you have to judge, if there's an important story and it's based on an anonymous source, the editor who supervises the reporter who has it needs to be especially careful. If there's only one anonymous source and several on-the-record sources that say this is absolutely untrue, that might be a reason for not running the story. You have to weigh those on-the-record sources very carefully as well. It isn't absolutely certain that you wouldn't run the story. It really depends. Reporters build up their own sources, and I don't have an absolute rule, is where I'm getting to. You have to be flexible about this. It's the higher, on the most important stories, it goes all the way up the chain to the editor-in-chief to make a decision about whether you would go with the story. And that depends on the level of trust and the level of perhaps other circumstantial evidence that you might have. We certainly don't rule out the use of anonymous sources, and again, the pressure of competition pushes one toward that, because you don't want to be, you want to break scoops some of the time. One of the ways in which you get an audience is that people feel they need to read you because you keep on coming up with some great stories. So again, it's an extremely difficult, it's a difficult thing to judge. One has to, in my view, do it on a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you a bit more of a personal question. What is it like being on the Facebook Oversight Board as a conservative? I know when we were talking, you were sharing with me your own experience having been censored on social media. So do you feel like you're in hostile territory all the time? Do you feel like that this is a reformable entity? Talk to me a little bit about the opportunity you have, but also what it's like and what some of the challenges there are.
Oh yeah, I'm in hostile territory all the time, I have no doubt. But I meet a lot of really decent liberal people that have never met a conservative before. They're like, what? You think ABC? It's a great opportunity to be among people that could be influenced. And we have an unfair advantage as conservatives. We're right. So look. Yeah. So my parents arrived in Florida in 1961. They fled Fidel Castro's Cuba after my parents saw their friends getting arrested, and my parents also saw the creation of the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, which exists to this day. And those are volunteers from each block that can go into your house and they can open your refrigerator and figure out if the food that you have there comes from a ration card or from the black market. They can look into your bookcase and see if you have a Bible. They can see if you're revolutionary enough. And by the way, that sounds familiar. You're right, but I'll talk about that later. So the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution is founded. My parents go to Florida. My father doesn't speak English. His great plan is to learn English by watching I Love Lucy. That plan did not work out. So we moved to Puerto Rico, where I grew up. It's a Spanish-speaking country, and we grew up allergic to government intervention. We should not need a permission slip from the government to exercise what our rights are. We should not have a government person sitting at our breakfast table telling us what to tell our children. And that I was privileged to be able to devote my entire life to defending those ideas. So what happens with social media platforms and why I'm so intrigued by it, when I was in 2016, I was appointed by the Speaker of the House, by Paul Ryan, to come to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, where I was the vice chair. And this is a watchdog, independent agency. We could push State Department around. They loved me there. We could talk to governments. We could talk about American principles. Many of our ambassadors abroad loved it when I visited. So there I am, able to recognize what we all know, right? We all know that we have the gold standard for freedoms. We know that people badmouth us around the world, but they really want to come to this country. And we know that we have a moral responsibility for the world, to the world. So what did I see there? I saw dissidents using social media platforms to circumvent their government. I was in Saudi Arabia, I was in Iraq, in Bahrain, in camps, in many places. And what I saw there in Myanmar, more people had access to Facebook and WhatsApp than to electricity and running water. So the potential of social media platforms are incredible. And just last November, you may have heard a black Cuban rapper who was rapping in Cuba against the government and for Donald Trump, and he gets arrested. And he live streams his arrest on Facebook. And it's the first time in 54 years that artists from all over Cuba take to the streets. And Facebook streaming of that imprisonment may have very well catalyzed a new movement towards freedom in Cuba. So I am more than happy to step into a place where I will never be the favorite person in the room, and try to use our powers of persuasion to talk about the real people that benefit from real freedom of expression, which everyone wants in this country, whether they say it openly or they don't. Very quickly, I wrote a piece for USA Today on the fact that the first week of college I was called a racial slur, which I'm not allowed to say here. And because I learned English from Catholic nuns, I thought it was a cool nickname, like Maverick on Top Gun. I had never heard the word before. And I thought I had really made it. And then a week later, I find out it's not that. So I approached the person who had called me the racial slur and knocked on the door. We had a good conversation. And I say, cancel culture would not have allowed me to have this conversation with this person. And I talk about cancel culture in Cuba through the Committee of the Defense of the Revolution, gets you killed, gets you in prison. No matter what's happening in this country, we need to preserve the ability to talk to each other about the most difficult issues. And we need more conversation. We don't need accusatory fingers. So the piece went viral. I'm not sure why. It was a good picture, just want to say. Piece goes viral. It was a joke. The piece goes viral, and then it's censored by Twitter. It's canceled by Twitter because it contained sensitive content about racism, even though I was the one who was called a racist slur. So I understand we need to do a lot of work, but this is the importance of Steamboat, right? It's not so much about the laws, but it's also about changing the culture and having people grow up in an atmosphere where they understand that this is what we need to do. And many people say, oh, I wish I lived in, no, Washington so I can make a difference. No, Washington is the place where the garbage ends. It's not where it starts. It starts here with each one of you pressing on your local elected officials, pressing on the people that you know to change the culture. So that's my long-winded answer to your question.
Great. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna rapid fire ask you a couple questions that are popping up from our audience. And Hugo, I'm actually gonna start with you. So I want to talk about social media's handling of so-called misinformation, both around COVID and around climate change. In what ways do you see collaboration between the government and social media? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to have you answer it, if you can, somewhat briefly, because I've got a follow-up for her.
Okay. Jen Psaki, the White House press officer, said that they worked with social media companies to point out the items which they thought were problematic. That in itself is extremely problematic. It raises First Amendment issues. What is the White House doing, contacting social media companies to say this is a problematic post? We know that the the social media companies are following government guidelines because, for example, it was only after the CDC decided that the Wuhan lab leak was not a conspiracy theory, but actually at least as likely as the previous explanations, that the social media platforms stopped suppressing that story. So we know that there is discussion between them. We know that the social media are suppressing things until the government says it's okay, you don't have to suppress them. That's a real problem. There's one other aspect of that, is that we all know about regulatory capture. There are companies that spend billions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to influence the government, and some of them are, for example, pharmaceutical companies. It's very interesting that social media suppresses absolutely innocuous discussion even by, for example, the man who invented mRNA vaccine technology, discussing problems with the vaccines. So, you know, I'm not saying there is a corrupt thing going on there. I'm just saying that, you know, basically, Jen Psaki admitted collusion. I didn't think collusion was going to be the thing between the Biden administration and other authorities.
Great, and this is going to be the last question of this panel because we're unfortunately running out of time. But I guess if you do have a relationship between government and the social media, deciding what content is valid and what is not, especially in the context of a time where the public square has been shut down, where assembly has been limited, and where essentially the public square has been privatized in a sense, does that merit a second look at Section 230? Is there a way to, I guess, protect the First Amendment in that context when government's getting involved with social media?
Yes, social media platforms should be watchdogs, not lapdogs. And if they don't function that way, they're not going to serve their purpose. But John, you mentioned this morning the common carrier idea. If it's really the marketplace of idea, it should have everything. That doesn't work either. Trump tried to start a new social media platform called Getter, and ISIS and pornographic sites had taken over immediately. There has to be a balance between the compelling interest of what serves the people and also preventing harm. And I think that something like the Oversight Board has the possibility of doing that if conservatives participate in this process and don't dismiss it as just another crazy Silicon Valley idea.
All right. Well, with that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. But thank you all for sending in your questions, and let's thank our two panelists.
Thank you.